The cowboy rode 3 days through a killing storm for a bride he had never even met, and what he found in the mountains made him forget the cold entirely. Snow slammed against the horse's face as Wade Sullivan dragged himself up the frozen ridge, one hand gripping the reins, the other wrapped around a silver necklace half buried in ice. Somewhere ahead, through the screaming wind, a woman cried out once. Then silence swallowed everything again. His gloves were stiff with frost, his horse trembling beneath him, but he kept riding deeper into the whiteout anyway. Comment below where you're watching from, and stay with me for this unforgettable story. The first hard snow came early that year. By the second week of November, Bitterroot Valley had turned white from fence post to riverbank, and the wind coming down from the mountains sounded like something alive moving through the pines. Wade Sullivan stood beside the corral gate with a hammer tucked through his belt and watched frost gather on the horses' backs. Dawn had barely broken. Smoke rose slow from the chimney of his ranch house, thin and gray against the pale sky. Everything around him felt tired. The barn leaned a little farther west every winter. One shutter on the house never closed right anymore. Half the north fence still carried repairs from spring flooding. Even the coffee tasted old these days. 41 years old and living alone, long enough to forget what another voice sounded like at supper. He drove another nail into the gate. The hammer strikes echoed across the frozen pasture. 3 years earlier, his younger brother Caleb had disappeared in a snowstorm hauling freight through Lost Horse Pass. They found the wagon in April after the thaw, never found Caleb. After that, the ranch got quieter. Wade stopped going into town unless he had to, stopped sitting in church socials, stopped answering questions from women who looked at him with pity instead of interest. Then one night in September, while oil lamps flickered low across the kitchen table, he opened a newspaper from Helena and stared too long at a tiny advertisement section near the back. Mail order introductions. He almost laughed at himself. But 2 weeks later, he mailed the letter anyway. Not because he wanted romance. Not because he dreamed about love. He simply couldn't stand hearing only the wind anymore. Most replies never went past the first letter. Some women stopped writing after hearing where he lived. Others asked how much money he made before asking his age. One woman wanted servants and silk dresses. Another wrote 3 pages about loneliness without asking a single thing about him. Then Naomi Carter answered. Her handwriting leaned slightly left, neat and steady. She wrote, "Mr. Sullivan, I can cook for railroad men, stubborn drunks, and hungry children. I suspect cowboys cannot be much worse than that." Wade had laughed out loud in the empty kitchen. Sound startled him. After that, the letters came regular. Not sweet, not foolish, real. She asked about snowfall depth, about wolves near the ranch, about whether Montana winters cracked window glass if the fire died overnight. He told her about hauling water before sunrise, about horses steaming in the cold, about hearing coyotes from the ridge behind the barn. She told him Kansas City never truly felt like home. "Some places look at you," she wrote once, "like they already decide you don't belong before you even speak." Wade folded that letter slower than the others. A few days later, he rode 20 miles to Cold Creek and bought 2 new wool blankets from the general store. "Got company coming?" old Mrs. Hargrove asked behind the counter. Wade only shrugged. At night, he began fixing things around the house. He replaced cracked boards near the porch, hung a second lantern in the kitchen, built shelves beside the stove. One evening, he even tried cooking gumbo from a stained cookbook Naomi mentioned in one of her letters. The result tasted terrible. Still, he ate every bite. December arrived mean and bitter. Snow packed hard against the ranch house walls. Ice gathered thick along the troughs. The road into Cold Creek nearly vanished twice beneath drifting snow. Then Naomi's final letter came. "I'll arrive on the eastbound train December 19th. If weather allows, I should reach Cold Creek before sundown. For the first time in years, Wade shaved carefully. The morning she was due to arrive, he wore his clean brown coat and rode into town before daylight. Frost coated his beard white by the time the train whistle echoed through the valley. Cold Creek Station stood crooked beside the tracks, windows glowing gold against the storm gray afternoon. Steam rolled over the platform as townsfolk gathered near the depot. Wade stayed near the edge, quiet, watching. The train arrived screaming against the rails. Metal groaned. Steam exploded upward. Passengers stepped down one by one into the cold. An older couple, a traveling salesman, two miners arguing over baggage, a mother carrying a sleeping boy. Wade waited. More passengers came, then fewer, then none. His eyes kept searching faces anyway. The conductor shouted final calls. Workers unloaded trunks into the snow. Still no Naomi. The wind picked up hard across the platform. One suitcase remained beside the baggage cart. Dark leather with a blue ribbon tied around the handle. No owner came for it. Wade walked closer slowly. The station master glanced toward him with an expression Wade didn't like.
You Sullivan?
The man asked quietly. Wade nodded once. The station master removed his gloves and unfolded a passenger manifest already smudged from melted snow. There was a Naomi Carter listed out of Omaha, he said. But he hesitated. Wade's jaw tightened. But what? The station master turned the paper around. Beside Naomi Carter's name sat a red ink stamp, transferred before storm. Wade stared at the words while steam drifted through the depot and snow hissed against the windows. Transferred where? He asked. The station master shook his head slowly. No record says. Outside, the train whistle blew again. And somewhere far beyond the mountains, the storm kept moving west. Wade stayed on the depot platform long after the train disappeared. Snow swept across the tracks in thin white ribbons. Men hauled freight carts toward storage sheds, while the last passengers hurried into the warmth of town. The blue ribbon tied to Naomi's suitcase fluttered in the wind beside the baggage crate. No one touched it. Wade finally picked it up himself. The leather felt cold enough to burn his fingers. Inside the station office, the potbelly stove clicked and hissed. The station master adjusted his spectacles and searched through papers again, though both men already knew there would be nothing new there. Could've switched lines in Omaha, the man muttered. Storm scrambled half the schedules east of Butte. Wade looked down at the red stamp again. Transferred before storm, not canceled, not missing. Transferred. That word stayed with him all night. By morning, Cold Creek had already turned the story into gossip. At McGready's saloon, boots scraped across sawdust floors, while men crowded around hot coffee and whiskey glasses. She probably came to her senses. One ranch hand laughed near the stove. Woman sees Montana in December. She heads right back east. Another man smirked into his cup. Could be she found herself a warmer offer. A few chuckles rolled through the room. Wade sat alone near the back wall, hat low over his eyes. He never touched the whiskey in front of him. Then old Ben Riker spoke from beside the card table. Heard she was colored. The room quieted some after that. Ben shrugged. Can't imagine this territory being easy for a woman alone. Nobody answered. Wade stood slowly, left coins beside the untouched drink, and walked out without a word. The wind outside carried the smell of snow and horse sweat. By dusk he was back at the ranch, saddling his bay gelding beneath lantern light. He packed blankets, jerky, coffee grounds, a rifle scabbard, and the folded passenger manifest from the depot. He stared once at the warm glow inside the cabin window. Then he mounted up. The next morning he headed south along the freight trail leading toward Lost Horse Pass. Snow buried most of the road markers already. Pine branches sagged heavy with ice. Twice he had to dismount just to clear fallen limbs from the path. Near noon on the second day, he found the overturned mail coach. One wheel stuck straight upward from a snowbank beside the ravine. Canvas flapped loose in the wind. Crates and torn luggage lay scattered down the slope below. A wounded mail driver sat wrapped in blankets beneath a rock ledge nearby, drinking weak coffee from a tin cup. The man's face looked gray from cold and exhaustion. "Coach flipped 3 nights ago," he rasped. Whiteout came fast. Horses panicked near the ridge. "What happened to the passengers?" Wade asked. "Some stayed with the wreck. Some wandered looking for shelter." The driver coughed into his sleeve. "Couldn't keep track once the snow started swallowing everything." Wade showed him Naomi's name from the manifest. The driver studied it a moment. "Think I remember her." He nodded slowly. "Quiet woman, dark green coat. Kept helping an old lady after the crash." He paused. "Didn't seem like someone who scares easy." That night Wade searched the woods around the wreck by lantern light. The cold dug deep into his bones. Near a frozen creek bed, his horse suddenly stopped moving. Wade lowered the lantern. There, half buried beneath drifting snow, lay a handkerchief stitched with a single letter, N. He crouched slowly and brushed frost from the cloth with his glove. The stitching matched the one Naomi once described in a letter from Kansas City. She had embroidered it herself during slow nights at the railroad hotel kitchen. Wade folded the cloth carefully into his coat pocket. The next afternoon he found an abandoned hunter's shack hidden among thick pine trees. Inside, ashes still rested warm beneath the stove grate. Someone had been there recently. A cracked porcelain cup sat beside the wall. Half a loaf of stale bread remained wrapped in cloth. Near the fire pit, Wade discovered a burned scrap of paper trapped beneath a boot heel. Most of the words had blackened away. Only one line survived: "I kept walking west." The handwriting looked hurried, uneven. Cold wind moaned through gaps in the cabin walls. Behind him, the floorboards creaked. Wade turned sharply toward the doorway. An older man stood there beneath a fur-lined coat, snow gathered thick in his beard. A long trapping rifle rested across one shoulder. "You tracking someone," the stranger said quietly. "Or burying yourself?" Wade kept one hand near his revolver. "Depends who's asking." The old man stepped inside slowly. "Name's Ezekiel Boone." He glanced once at the burned paper in Wade's hand, then toward the dark woods outside. "If that woman's still alive," Ezekiel said, "she ain't just hiding from winter." 3 days later they reached an abandoned rest station near the upper ridge. The barn doors hung crooked from broken hinges. Snow drifted knee-deep through the yard. Wade entered first. The smell hit him immediately. Old smoke, wet wood, and something metallic underneath it. A dark stain spread across one wall near the feed room. Blood, not fresh, but not old either. Outside in the snow, Wade lowered himself near a cluster of tracks hardened by ice. Large boot prints, 3 men at least, and beside them, a long drag mark cutting through the snow toward the tree line. The wind rose harder around the station. Neither man spoke for several seconds. Then Wade noticed something half buried beside the collapsed hitching rail. He reached down slowly. A silver necklace rested frozen beneath the snow, broken clean at the clasp. The small blue stone attached to it caught weak winter light between his fingers. Wade recognized it immediately. Naomi once wrote that her mother gave it to her before she died, and now it lay here, alone, in the middle of the mountains. Wade closed his hand around the broken necklace while snow hissed across the empty yard. For a long moment, neither he nor Ezekiel moved. Then the old tracker crouched beside the frozen footprints again. He touched 2 fingers against the edge of the drag marks and looked toward the northern ridge. "They took horses from here," he said quietly. "But whoever made these smaller tracks kept fighting." Wade slipped the necklace into his coat pocket. "Which way?" Ezekiel stood slowly. "Toward the timberline." The storm worsened by afternoon. Wind tore through the pines hard enough to shake snow loose in heavy bursts. Wade kept his collar pulled high while his gelding pushed through drifts nearly reaching its knees. Near sunset they found smoke, thin, weak, barely visible against the gray sky. Ezekiel narrowed his eyes toward a narrow ravine hidden between rock walls. There, they left the horses tied beneath the trees and climbed the slope on foot. At the top stood an old silver miner's tent shack half buried in snow. One side had collapsed inward years earlier. Torn canvas snapped in the wind like gunfire. Wade stepped carefully toward the entrance. His inside, firelight flickered low beneath a rusted stove. And in the far corner, wrapped in blankets, with a small knife clenched against her chest sat Naomi Carter. For 1 second, she looked ready to strike. Her breathing stopped when she recognized him. Wade removed his gloves slowly. "It's all right," he said. Naomi stared at him as though she no longer trusted her own eyes. Her face looked thinner than in the photograph she had mailed months earlier. Fever had drained the color from her skin. Loose curls clung damp against her forehead. One boot sat beside the stove. The other foot remained wrapped in torn cloth strips darkened by melted snow. "You came," she whispered. Wade nodded once. Naomi gave a small shake of her head, almost to herself. "Said to myself all week you wouldn't." The wind groaned outside the shack. Ezekiel quietly stepped back outside to give them room. Wade crouched beside the stove and poured water from his canteen into a dented coffee pot, already blackened from smoke. "You been alone up here? For 2 days." Her voice sounded rough from cold. "There was another cabin lower down," she said after a moment. 3 men came through after the coach wreck." She swallowed carefully. "They started taking luggage first. Watches, money, coats." She looked toward the knife in her hand. "One of them kept staring at me." Wade stayed silent. He said, "Folks north of the mining camps paid good money for cooks and laundry women." Naomi's fingers tightened around the knife handle. "Said no one would come looking for somebody like me out here." The stove popped softly between them. Naomi looked down at the floorboards before speaking again. "I waited till night. Then I ran." Wade handed her the tin cup of hot coffee. She tried to take it steadily, but her hands shook too badly. Without saying anything, he wrapped both his hands around the cup until the trembling eased. Naomi noticed the movement. So did he. Neither mentioned it. Hours passed beneath the sound of snow hammering the canvas roof. Wade fed wood carefully into the stove, while Naomi drifted in and out of sleep beside the fire. Once, during the night, she startled awake gripping the knife again before realizing where she was. "It's just the wind," Wade said quietly. After that, she finally loosened her grip. Near dawn, Wade unwrapped the frozen cloth around her foot. Naomi looked away immediately. 2 toes had turned dark from frostbite. The skin around them looked swollen and stiff. Wade said nothing for several seconds. He simply poured warm water into a basin and began cleaning the frostbitten skin as gently as he could. Naomi watched the fire instead of him. "I can still work," she said quietly after a while. "I know ranch books, cooking, sewing harness tears. I'm not useless. I know. But I may not walk right after this." Wade kept drying her foot with a clean cloth. Naomi forced out a weak laugh that carried no humor at all. "A crippled wife wasn't part of your advertisement." At that, Wade finally looked up. The firelight moved softly across his face. "No," he said, "but neither was crossing half a mountain alone in winter." Naomi blinked hard and looked away before he could see too much in her eyes. Later that morning, Wade helped her into her boots again. She tried standing once. Pain shot through her legs so fast she nearly collapsed. Before she could protest, Wade knelt silently in the snow and tightened the straps on her boots himself. The gesture left her speechless. No man had ever treated her injuries like something worth tending carefully. Outside, the storm had finally begun to thin. Sunlight broke weakly through the clouds over the Idaho Ridge. Ezekiel saddled the horses while Wade packed the remaining supplies. They had barely started down the mountain trail when Ezekiel suddenly raised one hand. All 3 horses stopped. Far below, near the narrow pass leading toward Cold Creek, 3 riders waited beside the trees. Even from that distance, Wade saw one of the men wearing a long buffalo hide coat. Naomi's breathing caught beside him. Her fingers slowly tightened around the saddle horn. "That's him," she whispered. The wind swept hard across the pass, carrying loose snow through the pine trees below. Wade studied the three riders without blinking. They had not seen him yet. One man leaned against his horse beside the trail marker. Another smoked near the rocks. The tallest wore a buffalo hide coat darkened with melted snow. Naomi's breathing had gone shallow. Wade noticed her trying not to tremble. "We'll take the North Ridge," Ezekiel muttered quietly. "Longer ride, but they won't spot us through timber." Wade nodded once. The detour added nearly 6 hours through rough country. By the time Cold Creek finally appeared below them, evening lamps already glowed behind frosted windows across town. Naomi sat stiff in the saddle from pain and exhaustion. When Wade reached to steady her near the ranch gate, she hesitated only a second before accepting his hand. The Sullivan Ranch looked different than she imagined from the letters. Smaller, quieter. Snow rested along the fence rails and barn roof in thick white layers. A lantern burned beside the porch steps. Smoke curled steadily from the chimney into the dark Montana sky. For a moment, Naomi simply stared at it. A real home, not a boarding room, not a hotel kitchen corner, not a borrowed cot beside strangers. Wade opened the front door, slowly. Warmth rolled out immediately with the smell of cedar smoke and coffee grounds. Naomi stepped inside carefully, leaning against the wall as she removed her coat. Her eyes moved across the room. Fresh curtains hung beside the windows. New wool blankets rested folded near the stove, and on the kitchen shelf sat a worn cookbook opened flat beneath a stone paperweight. "Gumbo," Naomi looked at it silently. "I burned the first 2 attempts," Wade admitted while hanging his coat. "Third one wasn't much better." The corner of her mouth moved for the first time since the mountains. Not quite a smile, but close. The next morning, Cold Creek learned she had arrived. By noon, people were already slowing their horses outside the ranch road to stare. Some only looked curious, others less so. At Pearson's feed store, Wade overheard 2 cattle buyers cancel next month's contract without much explanation. "Bad season for business," one man muttered while avoiding eye contact. By the weekend, 2 ranch hands quit. Neither caused trouble. Neither insulted Naomi directly. They simply packed their bedrolls and left before sunrise. Naomi noticed the empty bunkhouse at once. She said nothing. Instead, she tied on an apron and began repairing things nobody else had touched in months. She reorganized the supply shelves beside the kitchen, started keeping feed tallies in a clean ledger book, boiled water each morning before Wade came in from the barn. One afternoon, Wade returned from checking fence lines and found her sitting carefully on a stool near the porch, mending a torn horse blanket beneath weak winter sunlight. A small boy sat nearby listening while she read softly from an old newspaper. The child, Caleb Turner, belonged to a widow living 2 ranches over. He rarely spoke at all, but there he sat quietly beside Naomi, watching every page she turned. When Naomi noticed Wade standing in the yard, she stopped reading immediately. "Sorry," she said. "He wandered over while I was working." Caleb shook his head hard and pointed toward the paper, wanting her to continue. Wade leaned one shoulder against the porch post. "Looks like he made himself at home." Naomi lowered her eyes for a second, unsure whether he minded. Then Wade walked past them both and placed another split log into the wood box beside the door. "Too cold to sit out here long," he said. "You'll freeze that foot again." It was the closest thing to worry she had heard in his voice. That evening, snow tapped softly against the windows while Naomi prepared stew at the stove. Wade sat nearby repairing harness leather beneath lantern light. The silence between them no longer felt sharp, just careful, human. Then voices drifted through the partially open kitchen window from outside near the horse trough. Traveling cowboys watering their horses before town. "She ain't worth ruining yourself over," one man said. Another laughed low. "Sullivan's throwing away his ranch over a woman folks barely know." Naomi froze beside the stove. The men rode off, still talking. Inside the kitchen, only the stew continued, simmering softly. Wade looked up from the harness straps. Naomi kept stirring without turning around. "You don't owe me this place," she said quietly after a while. Wade set the leather aside. "That's not what this is." But Naomi only nodded faintly, as if she had already made peace with something painful. That night, long after Wade had gone to bed, she sat alone at the kitchen table beneath the lantern. The untouched wedding ring rested beside her hand. Outside, wind moved through the corrals. Inside, Naomi stared at the warm cabin around her like someone memorizing a thing she could not keep. Before dawn, she packed quietly. One dress, the blue scarf, her mother's repaired necklace. She left the ring on the table beside a folded note. Then she slipped out into the pale gray morning, carrying her bag and walking cane. Hours later, Wade came in from the barn with snow on his shoulders. The cabin felt wrong immediately. Too still. His eyes landed on the empty chair beside the stove. Then the note. He read it once. Then again. "You saved my life. Don't let me ruin yours too." Wade stood motionless for several seconds. Outside, thunder rolled faintly beyond the mountains. Another storm coming. He folded the note carefully and slid it into his coat pocket. Then he walked straight toward the barn. By the time the first hard snow began falling again, Wade Sullivan was already riding south into the storm. The wind hit hard the moment he cleared the ranch gate. Snow whipped across the open fields so thick it nearly erased the fence posts ahead of him. His horse pushed forward anyway, breath steaming heavy into the freezing dark. Wade rode with Naomi's note folded inside his coat pocket. Every few miles he checked wagon tracks, disappearing beneath fresh snow along the Bitterroot Road. She could not travel fast with her injured foot. That was the only thought keeping him steady. Near midnight he reached a supply crossing beside the railroad line south of Cold Creek. A freight wagon sat stranded near the ditch while two men fought to free one frozen wheel. "Seen a woman traveling alone?" Wade shouted over the storm. One of the men pointed farther south. "Freight convoy, headed toward Deer Lodge before the pass closed," he yelled back. "But they won't make the canyon in this weather." Wade turned immediately. By dawn, the storm had become dangerous. Snow fell sideways now. Tree branches cracked somewhere in the hills. Twice Wade nearly lost the trail entirely where drifting snow swallowed the road markers. Then riders appeared behind him. 3 of them. Vernon Pike rode at the front beneath a long oilskin coat, snow-packed white along the brim of his hat. "Hell of a morning to die chasing a woman," Vernon called out. Wade slowed his horse but did not answer. Vernon smiled thinly. "You owe half this valley money. Banks won't wait till spring." He pulled folded papers from inside his coat. "Sign the ranch over now and you walk away clean." Snow rattled across the leather saddle horns between them. Wade looked once at the papers, then at Vernon. "I'm busy." The smile disappeared from Vernon's face. One of his riders moved closer, blocking the narrow trail. "You don't understand," Vernon said quietly. "This storm closes by noon. You keep riding, you lose the ranch anyway." For the first time in years, something sharp crossed Wade Sullivan's face. Not fear, not grief, anger. He spurred his horse forward suddenly. The startled rider lost balance as Wade's shoulder slammed into him hard enough to knock him sideways into the snowbank. Horses bucked violently in the storm. Vernon cursed and grabbed for Wade's reins, but Wade swung free and drove his elbow into the man's chest before tearing loose down the trail. Behind him came shouting, but the storm swallowed most of it. By late afternoon, Wade finally spotted the freight convoy. 3 wagons stood trapped near the canyon ridge beside the railroad cut. Men struggled to secure tarps against the wind while frightened horses stamped through deep snow. Wade searched every face, then saw her. Naomi sat alone beneath the overhang of an abandoned storage shed near the tracks, wrapped in blankets with her cane resting beside her knees. For several seconds he simply stood there in the blowing snow. Naomi looked up slowly. The moment she recognized him, something fragile crossed her face. Not surprise, something closer to heartbreak. "You shouldn't have come," she said softly, once he stepped inside the shed. Snow hissed through cracks in the wooden walls behind them. Wade removed his gloves slowly, hands red from cold. "You left before sunrise." Naomi lowered her eyes. "I was trying to make it easier." "For who?" She didn't answer immediately. Outside, wind slammed hard against the loose rail door. Naomi stared down at her hands. "I heard what people were saying," she whispered. "Your workers leaving, contracts disappearing, folks staring every time I walked through town." Her fingers tightened around the blanket edge. "You already lost enough in your life without adding me to it." Wade stood quietly for a long moment. Then he reached into his coat pocket. Naomi's breath caught when she saw the wedding ring resting in his palm. "If you want to leave Montana," Wade said, his voice calm beneath the storm outside, "I'll take you myself." Naomi looked up at him finally. "But don't leave because somebody else decided you don't belong." The wind rattled the walls again. Somewhere farther down the tracks, a train whistle echoed low through the blizzard. Naomi blinked hard, trying to steady herself. All winter she had held herself together through fear, hunger, pain, cold nights, cruel stares, and long roads. But this man standing in front of her with snow melting off his coat, broke something open inside her. Tears slipped quietly down her face for the first time since Kansas City. Wade stepped closer carefully, as though afraid sudden movement might scare her away again. Naomi laughed softly through the tears and shook her head. "You rode through another storm for me. Looks that way." A small sound escaped her then, half laugh, half cry, and slowly, with trembling fingers, she took the ring from his hand. Winter finally loosened its grip weeks later. The snow along Bitterroot Valley began melting into dark rivers beneath the fences. Mud returned to the ranch roads. Horses kicked open patches of dead yellow grass beneath the thaw. Word spread quietly after Ezekiel Boone testified against Vernon Pike for sabotaging freight routes and intimidating smaller ranchers. The land dispute ended before summer. Wade kept the ranch. It never became wealthy. But little by little, things changed. One ranch hand returned first, then another. Caleb Turner still visited the porch every week to hear Naomi read aloud while Wade repaired tack nearby. People in Cold Creek stopped staring so much after a while. Life settled into ordinary rhythms. Coffee before sunrise, lantern light after supper, boots drying beside the stove. Simple things, good things. 1 year later, snow fell again over Bitterroot Valley. Naomi stepped carefully across the porch, using a polished hickory cane. Wade carved himself during spring rains. In the yard below, Wade worked on a new horse shelter, while smoke rose steady from the chimney behind them. A little orphan girl they had taken in from a church home near Helena ran laughing through the snowbanks, wearing a red wool scarf wrapped twice around her neck. Naomi stopped when she recognized it, the scarf she lost during the storm in the mountains. The child waved happily from the gate. Wade looked up from the hammer in his hand. Snow drifted softly around all three of them. "You still made it here on time," he said. Naomi smiled at him fully, then warm. "Certain. Home at last." Far across the valley, church bells echoed through the falling snow. And maybe that's the part that stays with you after the story ends. Not the storm, not the fear, not even the long ride through the mountains. Maybe it's the quiet things. A lantern left burning in a window. A man who kept searching when it would have been easier to turn back. A woman who spent her whole life feeling temporary, finally hearing someone say, without grand speeches or promises, that she belonged somewhere. If you were standing where Naomi once stood, tired, ashamed, certain you were becoming a burden to everyone around you. Would you have believed someone could still choose you anyway? And if you were Wade, would you have ridden into that storm a second time? Life has a way of freezing parts of us, sometimes through grief, sometimes through loneliness, sometimes through years of believing we have to survive everything alone. But every now and then, another person walks into that cold place and stays long enough for the thaw to begin. That's what this story was really about. Not rescuing someone, not saving the day. Just two wounded people building warmth where there used to be silence. If this story stayed with you tonight, tell me where you're listening from down in the comments. And if you'd like, stay a little longer here with us. There are still more stories waiting beyond the next snowfall. Stories about love, loss, second chances, and the kind of people who keep a light burning when the world turns cold.